Action stars like you don't survive without a script. The words landed like a slap. Not loud, not screamed, said with a smile, the kind of smile that comes from a man who has never once questioned whether he belongs in a room. The director looked at his shoes. The crew went completely, uncomfortably silent. And Chuck Norris, the man who had fought on 3 continents, trained in dojos that didn't have names, and earned black belts in arts that most people couldn't even spell, Chuck Norris set down his coffee cup. Slowly, deliberately. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't clench his jaw, he didn't do anything that you'd expect a man to do when another man just publicly questioned his entire existence. He just looked at Vin Diesel and smiled back. What happened next was never supposed to leave that room. 3 producers witnessed it, 2 camera operators, 1 stunt coordinator, who later said, and this is a direct quote, "I've been on sets for 30 years. I never saw anything like it, and I never will again." This is that story. The year was 2002. Hollywood was in the middle of an action renaissance. The Fast and the Furious had just detonated at the box office. Vin Diesel was no longer just a name, he was a phenomenon. He was the future. He was the guy every studio wanted, every director courted, and every magazine was putting on their cover. And Chuck Norris? Chuck Norris was Chuck Norris. But in Hollywood, where memory is short and money is shorter, that sometimes wasn't enough. The meeting had been arranged through back channels. A mid-sized production company was developing what they called a multi-generational action franchise. The pitch was simple. Old school meets new school. Grit meets flash. The kind of movie that older audiences would respect and younger audiences would actually buy tickets for. They wanted 2 leads. One of them, allegedly, was going to be Chuck Norris. The other, allegedly, was going to be Vin Diesel. The development meeting was held in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Century City. You know the type. All chrome and ego. Water bottles that cost $12. Assistants who don't make eye contact. Chuck arrived first. He always arrived first. That wasn't strategy, that was discipline. 30 years of martial arts training had rewired his internal clock. Being early wasn't a choice, it was a reflex. He sat at the far end of the table, poured himself a coffee from the carafe, didn't touch the pastries, just sat there, calm, still, the way a man sits when he has absolutely nothing to prove. The producers arrived, nervous energy, too many compliments, handshakes that lasted half a second too long. Then Vin Diesel walked in, and the room changed. That's the only way to describe it. The room changed. The temperature, the oxygen, the center of gravity, all of it shifted toward the door the moment he entered. He had that quality, the kind of magnetism that can't be manufactured and can't be taught. He wore it like a second skin. He was younger than Chuck by almost 20 years. He moved differently, looser, more electric, like a man whose body was constantly auditioning even when the cameras were off. He shook hands with the producers, laughed at something. Noticed Chuck at the end of the table, and something shifted in his eyes. Not hostility, not yet, just assessment, the look of a man measuring a room and deciding where he stands in it. The producers launched into their pitch, 40 minutes of concept art, story beats, franchise timelines, and revenue projections. They talked about legacy and torch passing and the synthesis of 2 eras. They used the word synergy 4 times. Nobody stopped them. Chuck listened without moving. Vin listened while leaning back in his chair, one hand on the table, tapping slowly, not impatiently, more like he was keeping time, like there was music playing only he could hear. When the pitch ended, there was a silence. Then Vin spoke. He talked about vision, about how the movie needed to feel current, about how audiences in 2002 didn't want nostalgia, they wanted now. He talked about his character arc, his physicality, his ideas for the fight choreography. He was sharp, precise. He clearly knew exactly who he was and what he brought to a project.
The producers were nodding, writing things down. Chuck had not yet said a word. One of the producers, sensing the imbalance, turned to him. "Chuck, what are your thoughts on the overall direction?" Chuck leaned forward. "I think the story should be honest. Action without truth is just noise. Simple. Clean." Vin glanced at him sideways. A brief look, maybe curious, maybe something else. The conversation continued, casting possibilities, budget breakdowns, distribution strategies, the kind of content that fills a meeting but rarely fills a movie. And then, gradually, the way these things always happen, the real conversation started bleeding through the surface of the professional one. It started with a joke. Vin made a comment about a particular fight sequence in the pitch, said it needed to be more grounded, less dated. He gestured with his hand, a vague sweeping motion that somehow managed to encompass Chuck's entire career in a single wave. Somebody laughed nervously. Chuck said nothing. Then Vin made another comment about scripting, about how the best action stars these days didn't just show up and hit their marks, they crafted the performance, they understood narrative architecture, they collaborated with directors on a level that the previous generation never had access to. No offense. And when someone says no offense, they always mean offense. Chuck picked up his coffee cup, set it back down. One of the camera operators, a man named David who since left the industry, said later that he watched Chuck's hand during that moment, and the hand was completely still. No tremor, no tension, just stillness. The kind of stillness that takes decades to develop. The producers shifted uncomfortably. Nobody wanted this to go where it was going. But it went there anyway. Because Vin Diesel leaned forward, put both hands flat on the table, looked directly at Chuck Norris, and said the sentence that would echo through that room for the rest of everyone's career.
3 seconds. That's how long the silence lasted after those words. 3 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in a quiet room after a sentence like that, 3 seconds is an eternity. 3 seconds is enough time for the air to crystallize, for people to stop breathing, for the entire social architecture of a room to teeter on the edge of collapse. The producers didn't move. The stunt coordinator, a veteran named Marcus who had worked on over 60 films, later described it like watching 2 tectonic plates meet. You could feel the pressure, he said, from both sides, but only one of them was visible. Vin Diesel held his gaze, chin up, shoulders relaxed, the posture of a man who has never once backed down from anything and has a box office to prove it. Chuck Norris looked at him. Not through him. At him. There's a difference. Looking through someone is dismissal. Looking at someone, truly, fully, completely, is the opposite. It's engagement. It's acknowledgement. It's the thing you do when you consider someone worth your full attention. Chuck gave Vin Diesel his full attention. And then he stood up. Slowly, not dramatically, there was nothing theatrical about it. He just unfolded from the chair. And for the first time in that meeting, people in that room truly understood something they had somehow managed to miss in the 45 minutes prior. Chuck Norris was not old. Chuck Norris was not dated. Chuck Norris was a weapon that had been politely sitting in a chair drinking coffee, and now it was standing. He walked around the table, not fast, not aggressive, just purposeful. The walk of a man who has crossed distances much greater than a conference room. He stopped beside Vin Diesel's chair, looked down at him. "Stand up," he said quietly. Not a command, not a threat, an invitation. The way a sensei invites a student to step onto the mat for the first time. The room forgot how to breathe. Vin Diesel, and to his credit, he didn't hesitate, stood up. They were close now, close enough that the producers on the other side of the table couldn't fully see what was happening, close enough that the stunt coordinator said later he instinctively moved towards them, not to intervene, just to be closer to whatever was about to occur. "You think scripts make action stars?" Chuck said. His voice was almost gentle. Vin said nothing, but his eyes stayed steady. He was not afraid. This was not a man who knew fear in a conventional sense. He was an action star. He trained, he prepared, he carried himself with a physical confidence that was completely legitimate. But Chuck Norris had not waited for permission his entire career. "Give me your hand," Chuck said. Vin looked at him. "Your right hand, open, flat." Something passed across Vin's expression. Calculation, curiosity, pride warring with something older and more instinctive, something primal that recognized, somewhere below the layers of movie stardom and box office millions, that it was in the presence of something categorically different from itself. He held out his hand, palm up. Chuck placed his own hand beneath it, palm up also, his hand under Vin's, like they were shaking hands vertically. "Don't move it," Chuck said. This was a test, an old one that Chuck had first encountered in a dojo in Seoul in 1968, a test of reaction speed, pure, unfiltered, neurological reaction speed, the kind of thing that cannot be trained in a gym and cannot be faked in front of a camera. The premise was simple. Chuck would try to slap the top of Vin's hand before Vin could pull it away. Sounds trivial, sounds like a party trick. It is not a party trick. At the level Chuck operated, the level of a man who had trained his nervous system for over 30 decades across 5 different martial disciplines, the strike happened before the human eye registered the intention. It happened in the gap between thought and movement, in the space that most people don't even know exists. The room watched. Vin watched his own hand, focused, jaw set, ready. He was not slow. Let that be understood completely. Vin Diesel was not a slow man. He was a man who had trained for action films with the same intensity that athletes train for competition. He was fast by any reasonable standard. Chuck moved. Even people who were watching for it didn't see it. What they saw was the result. The sound, a single, flat, precise crack, arrived before the visual information had processed. That's how fast it was. The sound came first. The slap came first, and then half a second later, the brain caught up and registered that Chuck's hand had moved, struck, and returned to its original position before the eye could track the arc. Vin pulled his hand back, stared at it, looked up at Chuck. In the room, complete silence. The stunt coordinator, Marcus, said he physically felt his stomach drop. He said, "I've worked with the best fighters in the business. I've watched people move who don't look real. Chuck's hand, I didn't see it, I only heard it. I've never told anyone that because it sounds impossible, but that's what happened." One of the camera operators said his first instinct was to reach for a camera, not because he was trained to capture things, but because his brain refused to believe it had just happened and wanted evidence. The second camera operator said nothing for a full minute. Chuck lowered his hand, looked at Vin Diesel with an expression that was not triumphant, not cruel, not even satisfied, just honest. "Scripts don't write what I just did."
Vin Diesel sat back down. Not in defeat, let that be absolutely clear. He sat down the way a man sits when he has just had an experience that requires processing, when something has entered his understanding that wasn't there 30 seconds ago. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at Chuck and said, and this was confirmed by 2 separate people in the room, "Do it again." Chuck looked at him. "I want to see it again," Vin said. And there it was. Not ego, not pride, not posturing. Genuine, pure, unfiltered curiosity. The thing that separates men who are good from men who become legendary. The ability, in the moment of being surpassed, to lean forward instead of pulling back. Chuck smiled, the first real smile of the entire meeting. He held out his hand again. He did it again. And again, Vin didn't catch it. Again, the sound arrived before the vision. Again, the room received a small education in what a human body becomes after 30 years of devoted, obsessive, absolute discipline. This time, one of the producers laughed. Not mockingly, it was a laugh of pure disbelief. The involuntary laughter of a person whose brain has just refused to accept what their eyes reported. "How?" Vin said. One word. "How long have you been training?" Chuck asked. Vin told him. Chuck nodded, did the math in his head. You have about 15 more years before you could possibly begin to approach that, he said, not unkindly, just factually, the way a mountain tells you how far it is. The mountain is not being arrogant, the mountain is just telling you the distance. Vin Diesel stared at him. And then he laughed. A real laugh. A genuine, unmanaged, unscripted laugh that filled the chrome and glass conference room and bounced off the city view behind him. 15 years? Vin repeated. Minimum, Chuck said. And somehow, impossibly given how the previous 5 minutes had gone, the tension left the room. Not because anything had been resolved in the conventional sense. No apology was issued, no retraction, no formal acknowledgement that the words "action stars like you don't survive without a script" had been said and had been answered. None of that happened. What happened instead was something older and more true. A recognition. Two men, separated by 2 decades and 2 completely different definitions of what it meant to exist in the world of physical performance, had collided and found in the wreckage of that collision a kind of mutual respect that could not have been achieved any other way. The producers tried to steer the conversation back to the film. Nobody was really listening anymore. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. The film, for reasons entirely unrelated to this moment, was never made. The production company dissolved. The franchise that was supposed to bridge 2 eras never bridged anything. But the moment remained. 5 people left that conference room that day carrying a story, and stories, unlike film projects, don't need financing. Within a week, the stunt coordinator Marcus had told 3 people. Not to gossip, he wasn't built that way, but because some things are too specific and too real to carry alone. He told his wife, he told his closest colleague on his next project, he told the director he trusted. Each of them told someone. By the end of that year, a version of the story existed in at least a dozen corners of the industry. Most of it was wrong. Stories always degrade as they travel. Details get added, details get subtracted. The speed of Chuck's strike, already extraordinary, became mythological in retelling. The size of the room grew, the number of witnesses multiplied. But the core of it stayed intact, because the core of it was simple enough to survive the journey. A young titan questioned a legend, and the legend answered without raising his voice. One version of the story reached a filmmaker in Vancouver who was prepping a documentary on the history of martial arts in Hollywood. He tried to track it down, called producers, left messages, got vague, comfortable non-answers from people who had signed enough NDAs to wallpaper a house. The footage was never released. Mostly because there was no footage, the cameras weren't rolling. It wasn't that kind of meeting. But that detail got lost somewhere along the way. In the phrase, "the footage was never released," became attached to the story like a barnacle, lending it the weight of conspiracy, of suppression, of a moment so powerful that forces larger than the moment had to contain it. That wasn't true. The truth was simpler and somehow more powerful. The moment needed no footage because the people who witnessed it didn't need evidence. They knew. The memory was encoded at the level of the body, not just the mind. The sound of that strike, that single flat crack in a glass-walled room on the 14th floor, lived somewhere below cognition, in the place where certain things get stored not as memory, but as knowledge. Marcus, the stunt coordinator, retired 4 years later. In his final interview for an industry publication, he was asked about the most remarkable physical performance he had ever witnessed. He paused for a long time. "I'm not sure I can talk about the one that actually comes to mind," he said. The interviewer assumed he was referring to a film set. He wasn't.
Here is what most people miss when they tell this story. The point was never the slap. The slap was just language. It was Chuck Norris saying something in the only dialect that could not be argued with, misquoted, or spun. The body does not lie. The nervous system does not perform. When a hand moves faster than the eye can follow, that is not a statement about ego or dominance or Hollywood hierarchy. It is a statement about time. Chuck Norris had given his time, enormous, irreplaceable, unrecoverable quantities of it, to the study of human movement. Not for fame, not for film. Long before anyone knew his name, he was in rooms without cameras, in dojos without spectators, in training halls where the only reward for showing up was the ability to show up again tomorrow slightly less ignorant than yesterday. That is what the hand was saying. This is what devotion becomes. He had started training in Tong-Soo-do while stationed in South Korea with the United States Air Force in the early 1960s, a young man in a foreign country, drawn to something he didn't fully understand yet, something that would take decades to reveal its full meaning. He had earned his black belt, then another, then another. He had studied under masters whose names are not famous, but whose influence is embedded in every fighter who came after them like code in a program. He had competed, he had taught, he had built a system, chun-cooked dough from the ground up, synthesizing everything he had absorbed across a career of learning that most people couldn't sustain for 5 years, let alone 5 decades. And then, and only then, had he made movies. The movies were the surface, the training was the water beneath. When Vin Diesel made his comment in that conference room, he wasn't wrong about the industry. He was right that the new generation of action stars brought something different to the table, a different kind of intelligence, a different kind of collaboration. The landscape had changed and he had changed with it, and that was legitimate. But there is something that no script can write, and no collaboration can manufacture, and no intelligence can shortcut. The 10,000 hours, the 20,000 hours, the hours that don't know they're building toward anything, that happen in the dark, in the cold, in the failure, in the repetition so complete it stops feeling like repetition and starts feeling like breathing. The hand that moved faster than Vin Diesel's eye could track was not a hand that had been to the gym 3 times a week and worked with a great choreographer. It was a hand that had been in conversation with the concept of speed for 40 years. And the lesson, the one that echoed out of that conference room and through every version of the story that followed, was not that one man was better than another. It was that certain things cannot be faked. Presence cannot be faked. Speed cannot be faked. The stillness that comes from genuine mastery, that quality Chuck had when he sat at the end of that conference table, completely unthreatened by the changing of the industry around him, cannot be faked. You either have it or you don't, and you only get it one way. Vin Diesel went on to build one of the most successful franchises in cinema history. He did it through intelligence, through passion, through a genuine and ferocious commitment to understanding what audiences want and giving it to them at the highest possible level. He earned his place at the top of the industry the hard way, and the place he occupies there is legitimate. He also, reportedly, according to people who worked with him in the years that followed, became notably more respectful of fighters who came from traditional martial arts backgrounds, more curious, more inclined to ask questions and less inclined to make statements. Whether that had anything to do with a conference room in Century City is impossible to know for certain. Chuck Norris continued being Chuck Norris. He kept training, he kept teaching, he built a charitable organization, Kickstart Kids, that has introduced martial arts to hundreds of thousands of young people across the United States, not to create fighters, but to create discipline, to create the thing that discipline becomes when it's applied not to competition, but to life. He made more movies. He became more of a cultural phenomenon. The internet discovered him and turned him into a mythology of a different kind, one built on jokes and impossible feats and deadpan humor that somehow captured something true about the way real skill looks from the outside. Impossible, effortless, unreal. Except it wasn't any of those things. It was the product of a life spent showing up, every day, without exception, to a practice that gave nothing back in the short term and everything back over the long arc of a committed existence. That's the story that gets lost in the jokes and the memes and the mythology. The story of a man who sat quietly at the end of a conference table while someone told him he was obsolete, and answered not with words, but with the only response that truly mattered. A demonstration, not of power, of time. In the end, the greatest action scene Chuck Norris ever performed happened in a room with no cameras, no audience, no script, and no director. Just a hand, and the 40 years that made it move the way it moved. No script needed, no script ever could.
They say only a handful of people saw it happen. They say the footage doesn't exist. They say the meeting was never documented. But every person who was in that room that day, when asked years later about the most extraordinary thing they ever witnessed in their career, goes quiet for a moment, and then they smile. Some stories don't need cameras. They just need to be true.